So we might just give people a couple of minutes to enter the webinar today. We're conscious that it's at 3:30, so just after school. So there might be some teachers still on their way to their computer. Um, while we're waiting to start, I might just let you guys know that this webinar is presented on behalf of a project called Race Victoria, which is funded by the Victorian State Government Department of Education and delivered by the Agricultural Education and Extension Research Cluster at CQ University. So the broader program aims to support rural and regional students to explore the world of work in agriculture and different kind of pathways or different kinds of jobs that exist in agriculture as well. So looking to raise those aspirations and deliver that career education, hence the acronym RACE, if you were wondering about that. And as part of that, we like to work with teachers, work alongside teachers for how they can integrate real world examples of the world of agricultural work into the classroom. And for that reason, we're delivering a series of teacher PD webinars. And when we put the call out for what kind of topics people were interested in, this one certainly came up. So I'm really excited to introduce on our webinar today, Millie Enbom Goad. And Millie's going to be talking to us about biosecurity and Varroa Mite. So a bit of background to Millie. I've got some notes written here, so if I look like I'm reading, I am. But Millie's a third generation commercial beekeeper based in Central Victoria, where she lives and works on farm with her partner and young family. Now, Millie began beekeeping at 15 and holds a science degree in environmental resource management with a focus on sustainable agriculture, participatory resource management, and Australia's forests. She also practices law. So Millie's deeply committed to protecting the natural resources our industry depends on. Millie's a strong advocate for improved forest stewardship, land access, and evidence-based policy to support long-term beekeeping sustainability. She's active in industry leadership and has been for almost a decade. Her current roles include being a board member for the Central Victorian Apiarists Association and the Victorian Apiarists Association Deputy Chair of Agri-Future's Honeybee and Pollination Advisory Panel. She's also a representative on the Victorian Government's Young Farmers Advisory Council. So Millie's passionate about building a resilient, forward-looking beekeeping industry that supports all Victorian beekeepers, and there's a few of them, through practical leadership, constructive advocacy, and environmental stewardship. So I'm going to hand over to Millie today. Now, we know that you will have questions for Millie throughout her presentation. So if you'd like to pop them in the chat, I'll keep an eye on them and check in with Millie then. Otherwise, save them for the end because we'll have time for a little bit of discussion there where we can sort of ask Millie more questions about this topic and also about her career in agriculture. So I'll hand it over to you, Millie.
Thanks, Nicole. Now, I can't see everyone listening, so if you do need something, feel free to put it in the chat or get Nicole's attention. So I'm going to talk away, and it is always a bit awkward when you're listening to a bio of yourself from someone else. So, but and you think about all the things that you do, but yes, like many people in agriculture, we do a lot. So I'm going to talk about, I can talk about bees forever. So I'm going to try my best to keep it pretty succinct, but I am going to go over everything in case there's anyone listening that isn't familiar with beekeeping and what beekeeping looks like. So if I can, I'm going to talk a bit about bees and commercial beekeeping in Victoria, in particular pollination and food security, biosecurity, and the Varroa Mite, which many of you might have heard a little bit about on Country Hour or on the radio, or there's been various news articles recently, but there's a bit to it. So first of all, the European honeybee. What the bee that most of you, particularly Victorians, will be seeing in your garden is most likely the European honeybee. In Victoria, we do have native bees, but all the bees down in this cool climate are, those native bees are solitary. So they're not living in a large colony like you think of when you think of a swarm of bees. They're living, by themselves, in like a little hole in the mud or in a wall or in a stick and things like that. So the European honeybee is what I'm going to be talking about when I'm talking about bees today. So, and they're not native to Australia. I've made a mistake there. They are not native to Australia on the slide, and they were introduced in the 1820s. But like many things, and like us, we've thrived, and they've thrived in the Australian environment. And there is a huge population of wild honeybees, or, up until now, there has been a huge population of wild honeybees all throughout Australia, and throughout our forests that survive without any human intervention or management. And that's just part of the way that bees are. They are livestock, but they're quite a niche sort of livestock compared to other farm animals. So in Victoria, so they're the wild honeybees. So, and I put that there because I'm going to come back to that later, because it's really important to this discussion about Varroa. But in terms of managed honeybees in Victoria, there's more than 11,000 registered beekeepers. So that's everyone from one hive, from 0 hives. They just want to be a beekeeper, so they've registered. They're super keen, and they've registered with the government in case and for when they get that swarm, they get their beehive, up into like 10,000 sort of beehives for your very large scale commercial operator. Most of those beekeepers are hobbyists. So, almost 11,000 are recreational or hobbyist beekeepers. Depends on, people like to be called different things, but some variation of that. They're not deriving an income from it. Commercial operators, or people that are deriving an income, and we're starting to talk about, up into the larger scale of things. So there's less than 150. So it's a really small industry, and it's getting smaller. And that's part of this Varroa discussion, but it's also, fuel and increase, higher costs, and part of the agricultural landscape that we're looking at. When we're talking about commercial beekeepers and you look at figures, often institutions and government and things will look at more than 50 hives. From an anecdotal or from my personal experience, to be making enough income currently, in modern day, you've really got to have a couple of 100 hives. But often people start out and they start with a smaller amount, like with anything, and then they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's exactly what I did when I didn't start off with 1,000 hives when I was 15, where you started off with 1 and 2. And then, slowly grew from there. So the average, and we're probably sitting, we fluctuate. So it's like anything with livestock, you don't always have 100 cows. Sometimes you have 80 cows, sometimes you have 120. And just like with beehives, the number fluctuates across the seasons and depending what's happening. What's really important though, when we're talking about commercial beekeeping, is that to run that amount of hives, to run 500 plus hives, you really have to be migratory, which means that we have trucks. So beekeepers, this weirds people out sometimes, but beekeepers talk about trucks all the time. Like, beekeepers love their trucks. They love looking at other trucks. They love comparing their trucks with other beekeepers. So trucks is a big part of our business. And we drive a huge amount of miles. Like, it's nothing for, like, I had a friend drop in last night, and they were driving up to the Mallee to almond pollination. And so they'll drive 5 hours and drive back the same night. So a lot of driving is involved for commercial beekeepers. And we use loaders. You can see on the picture here, there's a loader on the back of that truck there, and we'll load them up. In the past, it was all done by hand, but we load them up with equipment and machinery. And it's an operation, and it's a business, like any sort of large scale agricultural business. What is quite different though is, unlike your standard farm, we don't have paddocks all next to each other that we can rotate through. What we need to do is, if the resources in one paddock or one farm or one forest aren't providing the food we need to then load our bees up and drive to another part of the country. And that could be an hour away, or it could be 5 hours away, or it could be even longer. And so they're our paddocks, and we rotate through them across the season and throughout the year, and over the course of years. And we are very, very reliant on forests and healthy forests to sustain healthy hives. This is because, and I might talk about that in a second, but this is because that we need not only honey, but we also need pollen. So bees eat nectar, which they turn into honey. And so the nectar is their carbohydrates. Pollen, on the other hand, is protein. So the bees need energy to go and gather more nectar, to gather pollen, but they need pollen and protein to breed. So a worker bee will only live about a month. right? The queen bee often lives, depending on what happens in her life, a year or more, or a couple of years, but the worker bee only lives a month. So the queen is constantly laying eggs and rearing new brood. That's the baby bees, is the brood. So there needs to be a constant flow of pollen and nectar. And in Australia, our forests often have these huge nectar flows for a short period of time, for a couple of months, and then they stop, but there's not much pollen. Whereas the honeybee is from Europe, European honeybee, and a lot of the European plants have both nectar and pollen at the same time, and so they can sustain themselves fairly easily, whereas we need to move around to be able to get these things. Now, in terms of different beekeeping businesses, so traditionally in Australia, the industry was based on honey production, because we get these huge honey flows from our eucalypt forests, which were, very high quality, amazing honey. I'm not biased at all, of course. Amazing honey, and it's an amazing resource from the forests. In the last decade or so, pollination has become an increasingly important part of industry, because as farms get bigger, and as our agricultural systems change, there needs to be a more intense pollination event to occur to allow those yields to be sustained. And we're working on tight margins and things like that. You need to have as high a yield as possible. So pollination is increasingly seen as a viable part of industry, in a way to make industry sustainable long term, when there is more variability in terms of climate change and fire, the impacts of fires on forests, and changing land use as well. Other types of beekeeping activities or businesses that not many people think about or realise are queen rearing or bee breeding. And so there's people that rear queens, and that often involves, when you're doing that commercially, artificial insemination of queen bees. So it's a very niche career, but it is very, very interesting. And anyone who's interested in genetics, bee genetics, are super interesting. They're quite different to humans and mammals. So its insects are amazing. For people that think like that and that are interested in that, I'm certainly one of those. So I'm a bit of a nerd. But also pollen and royal jelly. Not necessarily in the Australian market, but overseas there's huge markets for pollen and royal jelly for health supplements, and honey as a health food as well. So there's a whole range of different sort of types of beekeepers. Most beekeepers in Victoria do a mix of honey and pollination. Only a very few do their own queen rearing, but that changes, that changes depending on where in the country you are. So in New South Wales or Queensland, I know there's some areas where people do mainly pollination, and that's what they do, and they're not so interested in honey production. But it is changing, depending on honey prices and global trade and things as well. It changes with time. All right. I'm going to talk about food security, and it's important, and this is a really important part of the piece, because beekeeping is not just about honey production. It's about pollination, but people don't really realise the scale of the impact of European honeybee pollination on our food supply. And that's where the food security piece comes into it, because food security means that we have a reliable food supply, there's affordable food, there's quality and nutritional diversity of the food, and there's resilience against disruptions. But without pollination, the supermarket shelves would be really quite barren. And this is because about a third of food in Australia relies directly on pollination. And that's things like, 100% reliance on pollination is things like almonds. I think 90% is things like cherries and melons and all the berries that you eat. But then when you think about the secondary or the indirect reliance on pollination, it sort of flows down to even like not grains as much, but any feed that needs, that flowers for the most part. So you think about lucerne, canola seed requires beekeeping pollination for that to occur. Any crops like that, any cover crops like that, sort of require pollination as well. So it feeds through to much more than just the direct fruits that you think of when you think about bees and what bees are pollinating. This is a picture here, because I threw in some pictures of a canola seed. So this is a canola seed crop, and It's quite common across Victoria. So for anyone that's not from a regional area, if you're driving through and you see a whole paddock of yellow flowers, that's canola. And so canola is a huge crop, and canola seed needs to be pollinated by bees, and then the seed is sold on to farmers who plant the canola with it. So it's about that production. So the seed that we pollinate becomes the crop for next year. So there is quite, you know, a cycle to it. It's people think it's really pretty. It can be. But what is really cool, it depends. Well, it depends, right? From a beekeeping perspective, it's one of those things that you've got to, we often think about and we talk about, and I'm going off script a little bit here, but talk about sprays and you know, agricultural sprays and chemicals and how they interact with hives and pollinators. And so it's any large crop like canola or like almonds there'll be chemical sprays used, and it's a careful dance between having bees nearby, what's being sprayed, what you're using within the hive, and just managing the health of the hive. So it's something that beekeepers are super aware of, but we try and talk a lot with farmers as well and agronomists about that relationship and, you know, awareness, so that if you need bees to pollinate something on your farm, you've got to think about, well, how can we manage things that might harm bees, which is your chemical sprays, which is, you know, all sorts of things as well can happen. And that brings me to almond pollination. And I use this as an example of, you know, a large scale pollination event. And unless you've driven up there and had a look at these trees and these orchards, you can't understand the scale of it. It's almond trees as far as you can see, with often not very much else. And in order to pollinate that many trees, so there's hundreds of thousands of hives that are moved into almonds, and this is happening right now, right? So this is up sort of near the Mallee, so up northern Victoria. And there are truckloads of bees being moved around the country at night, unbeknownst to the everyday man and woman and sleeping in your home, driving to northern Victoria from Queensland, from South Australia. Sometimes there's, you know, hives trucked over from Western Australia, and they're moved into position for 4 weeks, and then they're trucked out again. And that's the pollination event. And as you can imagine, this has with it some biosecurity concerns. Whenever you have a large-scale event where you're bringing livestock from all over the country, you're going to have a spread, or the risk of a spread, of pests and diseases. And this is why biosecurity is so important to this conversation around food security and pollination, because if we're not able to manage biosecurity well, we're not going to have a sustainable industry, and we just won't have the bees to pollinate our food crops into the future. These lovely signs, you might see them around, and beekeepers have them as well. Although we don't have farms necessarily, we have plants or extraction places that we work out of, or bee sites in the forest, or if we're on someone else's farm with our bees, we might put one of these up as well, just to let people know that it is important to respect the biosecurity of the farm or the place that you're entering. The sorts of diseases and pests that we have, you know, bees are livestock, so there are pests and diseases, you know, that are present, and some are more harmful than others at different times or at different parts of the country. I've listed a couple here just to give an example, but so we have sort of brood diseases, which are diseases in the hive, and they're things like American foul brood, European foul brood, chalk brood. So they can be managed with antibiotics, or they can be managed through practices, sort of in terms of cool storage of different parts of the hive. There's all these different things you can do to manage them. And then there's pests like small hive beetle and wax moth and Varroa Mite. So again, it's just about whether, you know, like with any livestock, you've got to manage these things, and you've got to work out a way to control them or to limit the impact on the health of the colony as a whole.
Hey, Millie, can I ask a question?
Sure.
How do you give bees antibiotics?
So when EFB, European foul brood, I'll switch back to this one. There was a big outbreak in the 80s. Before my time, I know, but I've heard lots about it, lots of stories about it from people. So when that was a big outbreak, then there was a lot of advocacy and stuff about being approved, because we have to be approved to use treatments through the APVMA, which is the Agriculture Pharmaceutical Veterinary Product. I can't remember anyway. So because they're livestock, they have to be approved through the veterinary, approval board and process. So there was a lot of advocacy to get an antibiotic approved. And then there was a lot of debate, and it was very controversial about whether it was best to use as a dry powder or a liquid. So you would we don't use antibiotics, so I am going offhand here a bit, but I'm pretty sure they just sprinkle it on top of the frames and the bees what the bees, they clean out the hive. So this picture here, to me, I think this is probably small hive beetle larva, and this is really messy hives, and the bees are naturally very, very clean insects, and they will clean everything out of their hives that they can. So a hive is healthy if it's cleaning stuff out the front door and they're throwing things out because they're very clean, they're managing it all, like it's spotless, right? And that if you put anything in it, they'll clean it out. So and they'll chuck it out the front door. So that's why when you want to treat them, you can put stuff, or if you want to feed them, you can sprinkle stuff on top of the frames, and they'll clean it all off. And as they're cleaning it off, they wipe it on their bodies and they eat it and they get it on themselves, and that's hence the antibiotics work like that.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So it's just like anything else, right? I suppose exposure or internally, like ingested. So there's that mix of different and how treatments can work, but yeah. So, and this, I mean, and I want to just point out, like, this is not normal. A hive shouldn't all look like the picture I've got here. This is like a big infestation, and it's all been slimed out and gross, and the bees are probably all dead. So, if for anyone, there shouldn't be other things other than bees in your hive. And this is where Varroa Mite is a big problem, because the bees can't get rid of it themselves. Now, I've talked a little bit why biosecurity matters, but I think that's pretty clear. Like, I think Australia has quite a good reputation in terms of biosecurity, and we talk about it a lot. And the best example of that is the Varroa Mite, because it's been around the rest of the world for decades. So it's not a new thing. It's not a new pest. It's been, being managed in the US and dealt with in the US and the UK and Europe and New Zealand for decades and decades now. It's just that because we had quite good biosecurity protocols in place and very strict importation guidelines, that we didn't have it, or it wasn't detected in Australia until 2022. So we've done a good job from that perspective, but it means that because there was such a lag, particularly between us and New Zealand, that we got a bit complacent as an industry, I think, as well. And then there was this incursion, and things rapidly went downhill, which tends to happen. This is the Varroa Mite. So this tiny thing here, and this is zoomed in, this photo, obviously, and these are the white sort of caterpillar looking things are the brood. So that's the baby bees before they're pupate and become an adult bee. And what happens is the Varroa go in. They're external parasitic mites, so they feed on the larvae, on the pupae. They go into the cell. When the bees cap it over during pupation, then they reproduce, and they lay a lot of eggs, and they reproduce quite quickly. And then the bee hatches, and out with it come all these extra mites. And that happens on a large scale, obviously, across the hive, because there's, at any given time, there could be, thousands and thousands and thousands of pupa hatching or being laid, and it's sort of a cyclical system. It's the most damaging honeybee pest worldwide, right? It is a huge problem overseas. They've had it for decades, but it is still a huge problem in many countries. And, and part of that discussion and that piece is around what it does and how it works. So the Varroa itself isn't necessarily what kills the bees in all situations. It can, because it weakens the bees and it weakens developing bees, and it suppresses their immunity. It's also a vector for viruses. So what happens is it suppresses the immunity, it weakens the bee, and it spreads viruses. And that combination of things is what often leads to the death of the hive once it has Varroa, because unless the hive is very, very strong, it can't sustain the virus load and the weakened immunity and the weakened state of the bees for very long at all. And that's what causes that reduction in the lifespan. Now, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I think it's relevant here in that bees can learn and breed and become resistant or resilient towards mites, but it takes a long time. And so that's where the discussion and the change in industry comes around as well. In the meantime, it means that we as beekeepers need to take up a lot of that load and help manage the bees to sustain the beehives until we can get to a point where we have that, we have a breeding program in place and we can breed for those traits. And that's not quite as straightforward or simple as breeding for mammals, like I alluded to earlier. It's a little bit complicated and quite a long-term project. And so we need to have there's going to be a bit of a transition till we get to that point where we can, reliably breed resilient and resistant queens, and then people can buy their queens and they get posted out to you in the mail, and then you can use those queens and those genetics for your own hives. And so that's the plan and the goal of where we want to end up as an industry, or where I think we should end up as an industry if we want to be sustainable moving forward long term. So a little bit of a background to how Varroa got here, because it is quite important in terms of the biosecurity, because the first wave or the first incursion was detected in New South Wales in 2022. And so what happened was then they tried to eradicate it as an invasive species, invasive pest, but it spread very, very quickly. And down this coast, for anyone that's been up through those national parks, that's a very difficult country to access. And the amount of wild honeybees through much of the forests means that they were trying to kill off honeybees in the forest to stop the spread, but there were lots of concerns around the impact that might have on native pollinators and other animals in the forest. And it was quite a contentious program, and there was a lot of tension in the community as well, and with beekeepers, because beekeepers' hives were also getting destroyed. So a lot of beekeepers lost their businesses and their livelihoods, and into multi-generational beekeepers as well. All their hives were killed as a part of the eradication process. When it became clear that it wasn't going to work, it became a transition to management. And while this was happening, there was the spread to Victoria, to South Australia and Queensland. So we now have Varroa Mite all down the East Coast, and South Australia only just, and more recently. And that's as far as it's gone so far, but it's just a matter of time. Because bees swarm and they don't really listen to you when you put a fence up. They will go wherever they want to go. Sometimes you can't stop that spread, and it's just that's evolutionary. They're bred to swarm to protect their genetics, and they will swarm in the right conditions. They will swarm and swarm and swarm no matter what you as a beekeeper can do, no matter how hard you try, which we all do try to limit it, but it does happen. What has since happened after that first incursion through Newcastle was a secondary incursion of Varroa, which was discovered late last year. Why this was important was because the first incursion, those mites, there was lots of research quickly happening, and those mites didn't have resistance to the various classes of chemicals that we can use to treat Varroa, synthetic chemicals we can treat Varroa. What was important about this second incursion was they discovered it in northern New South Wales as well, a bit further north in Newcastle, I believe, was that the secondary incursion is found to have resistance to, first of all, the main chemical, synthetic chemical that you can use to treat it, and which was a bit of a blow. But what they didn't realise was that it was also resistant to the second class of synthetic chemical that we can use to treat it. So in Australia, and that means both of those chemicals, synthetic chemicals, are no longer effective to treat Varroa Mite. That has put everyone in a bit of into topsy-turvy, because even people who wanted to manage Varroa Mite organically or not using synthetic chemicals, or there was always the backup of, if this doesn't work in our environment, in our conditions, then we can use a synthetic chemical, and we can, it's a bit crass, but we can nuke it, and we can start from the baseline again. We don't have that anymore, because if we were to use synthetic chemicals now, what we're doing is actually spreading resistant mites even quicker, because you'll kill all the non-resistant mites. And what that happens, it means only resistant mites are breeding. And so then you're just going to spread resistant mites even quicker. So we've had to very quickly pivot as an industry to move away from using synthetic chemicals at all, in terms of the Varroa Mite management, and look to, well, what non-synthetic or organic chemicals can we use? And I mean, the benefit of the non-synthetic chemicals is that there's no resistance. So, and there's no contamination for the most part in most of the chemicals that we can use. There are other things we can do as well to manage it, and these are called mechanical interventions, right? So, actually getting in the hive and doing something different to change the way that the Varroa mite is reproducing. So there's a thing called queen caging, which sounds very barbaric, but it's not, and drone trapping. And that's just, it's just different ways to interrupt the life cycle of the Varroa mite to reduce the amount of times it can reproduce. And they're quite effective, but it becomes a matter of cost and labour and what works best. And some things work for small scale, for a few hives in the backyard, and some things just aren't effective on a large scale as well. So it's a matter of people trying out what works for them. And there's a lot of trying out at the moment, and there's a lot of opportunity, I suppose, for people to work out, well, what works best in a certain region, what can we do, and what, we're being forced into it, but the silver lining is that there's a lot of innovation happening at the moment as well. And this, I'm just mentioning breeding here because this is a long-term way to manage Varroa. And if we do want to breed, I think, we have to think carefully about what our treatments and how we're using it are, and what we're going to breed from. And that means that for the time being, we need to maintain strong hives and strong hive health. And that is a way to manage Varroa as well, because even if you are treating for mites, if the hive health, if you don't have the resources, if you don't have the protein and carbohydrates, your bees are going to crash and die, regardless of how well you keep the mite numbers down, because of disease spread and just because of the immune impact of the Varroa mite. So that's this transition period until we get to a point where we have a stable mite population, and until we have a point where we can start breeding for resistance. In the interim, though, we've got to remember that wild honeybees that are spread all throughout most of Australia's bush aren't going to be treated by anyone, because they're not being farmed, they're not being managed, and they're going to continue to spread Varroa mite until the bees die or the bees become resistant. And so what will happen is there's going to be a huge crash of that unmanaged, or the pollination services that we take for granted as communities. And that's not just in the country, but also in the city. So a lot of there's feral hives, we call them feral hives, but wild hives, feral hives is different language to use, but they're everywhere. I was at a market thing in Melbourne, I can't remember what the gardens are called, right in the CBD, surrounded by skyscrapers, and we were selling honey, and these bees started coming and eating some of the honey from the samples, and we marked them with Texta to see how far it took them to come back, and it was a couple of minutes. So they were not flying very far at all. They're probably flying to a tree right above us and then flying back. There are feral hives or wild hives everywhere. Once they all die, the pollination of our orange tree in the backyard, or our fruit and veggie garden, or our trees, or our, from a city point of view, but then spreading out to the country as well, to orchards and farms, is going to drop quite a lot. And the yield will drop quite a lot. And this is already happening in New South Wales, but we've probably got a year or two until we start to really see the impact on food production in Victoria. Now, you can see here in the picture, I'll just explain that, because so you can see what we're doing. One way to check for mites is to spear with a little fork the pupae, and it's the drone pupae there, and you can see there's a mite right on there, and it's just a quick way to test if there's any mites. And I mean, now that I think about it, it probably looks a little bit crazy to people not in industry that we just spear out the babies and see, but the impact of Varroa when you don't know you have it is much worse than killing a few pupae. The whole hive will die. So it does look quite gross, but we have to do it. Otherwise, if you don't manage and check for Varroa, then the hive will die fairly quickly, particularly at the moment with this high reinfestation from the wild honeybees. It's quite a difficult time to manage. What this means for beekeepers, and that's a picture of me there, by the way. You can't tell, I'm all dressed up, but it means increased monitoring and record keeping. So it's a lot more work to just monitor and record mite loads in hives. Because remember, we're not just doing one hive. This is a yard of, there's like 80 hives there all together that we're managing, and that's only one yard. And it means you've got to drive there more, so higher fuel costs. It means that you have to spend more time there monitoring and record keeping, but also then treating, and the additional costs and the higher costs associated with treatments, with equipment, with and other costs like that. There's also the risk, right? Using these chemicals and things that we're using have a risk with them, and there's a risk to beekeeper safety from chemical treatments, and that's something that we're trying to advocate for and understand better as well. And because of Varroa, there's a possibility of other disease outbreaks as a consequence of the hive's immunity. So not just is it managing Varroa, but it's also spending more time and funds managing other diseases and better ways to do that. And I'll just explain, I'll go back. I don't normally wear, you might have seen, I don't normally wear a full outfit beekeeping like this. I normally just wear like a button-up shirt and a veil and a hat. But because I'm using a acid as a chemical treatment vapor here, I've got on a full face mask, I've got on gloves, I've got on a full overalls and everything. And that's another part of doing it, is changing what we do and what we wear and what we use and the equipment we use. And so there's quite a large learning curve at the moment, which is an opportunity for people getting into it, because as people say, it's harder once you're used to your own system or you've been doing something for a long time to change your system. But it's for people that are getting into Varroa right now, into beekeeping right now, you've already got Varroa. They're going to learn how to manage Varroa as part and parcel of beekeeping. And so they won't know any different. So it'll be, in a way, it's easier for them to pick up those systems than it is for the people that have been doing it for a while already. They need to change what they're doing. There's always that transition time. But what does Varroa mean for pollination? Because I think this is where we come back to that food security and that piece, or how is it actually going to affect pollination in Victoria? What it means is there'll be less commercially managed beehives available for pollination contracts in the short term, because there is high workload, there's higher costs to managing the bees and to treating for Varroa, and you're not physically able to manage higher numbers of bees unless your business is growing. So a lot of beekeepers, and in the medium to smaller area, are considering leaving the industry right now. But some of the big beekeepers are getting bigger. What it also means, though, is there'll be a drop in yield for any crops that were previously relied on pollination from wild honeybees. And that's what I discussed before with, as the wild honeybees die out, there is going to be that drop. An interesting example from New South Wales and apple orchards in New South Wales last year, or this last season rather, was one apple grower cited that he only had 10% of his normal yield. And that was attributed to the lack of pollination. So 10%, that's huge. That to drop your output and your income by that much, it's not sustainable at all. And it's about, we've got to work out, making those relationships. And I think there's a lot of work to do, like strengthening the relationships between different types of ag industries, so that we can, and spreading awareness about Varroa and about pollination, so that we can make sure there's less of a gap in the meanwhile, from those wild honeybees, so we can take that place as commercial beekeepers. What it also means, unfortunately, though, is pollination costs, will probably increase because there's less bees available, and there's more pressure on the beekeepers that are managing those bees. So those costs might increase as well. So it's a very interesting time in our industry. So I hope I'm not all too much doom and gloom, and this is interesting for everyone, because it's quite complex as well in terms of how it feeds through, and especially because pollination, and I think I'll put this here as well, because when you pollinate a crop, just because you're pollinating a crop, or the bee is pollinating a crop, it doesn't mean that the bee is getting a lot of food from that crop, right? It might be that they're doing the pollination job, but they're only getting a really small amount of pollen, or the pollen they're getting is not of nutritional benefit for them, and they're not getting honey, in which case then the bees' health will drop while they're on that pollination, and you're there for a contract. And so then you've got to think, well, where can I go? Where can I take my bees after this, so that their health can be supported? So just because a bee is working a crop does not mean it is benefiting nutritionally. And so that's why, and I talk a bit about forests earlier on, but that's why the access to forests and healthy forests are so important to beekeepers. And a lot of people that get into beekeeping, or a lot of the old time beekeepers, are people that were interested in the bush, that were interested in forests and forest management, or interested in wood and timber. And historically in Victoria, a lot of people that worked in timber and, in the timber industry became beekeepers, or, because of that interest in the forest and that real passion for, forests and spending time in the forest. So it's a bit of a weird intersection between different sectors that people don't realize from the outside, but a lot of the old school beekeepers, at least, they're nature lovers. They are very strong advocates for conservation of forests and better management of our forests, because it's such an important resource for the bees as well. So it's just something that I'm really passionate about, forests as well, obviously. And it's a hard link to draw, and it's a bit complex to get there when you work through, well, why are forests important for food? It's because bees are in the middle, and bees need the forests, and the food needs the bees. And I say that a lot of times, I know. But I wanted to talk a little bit now, because I've been talking doom and gloom about Varroa, but about research and innovation, because there is a lot of work being done in industry, but also working with, different groups to explore what research can be done in Australia and what we can homegrown, into either, are there new treatments, or are there other ways we can treat? Are there new nutritional supplements that we can give our beekeepers an edge, or different management techniques, pollination management, but also technology around reducing labour required and record keeping. Things like remote sensors and AI and all this sort of stuff is coming into it. So there's a lot of cool stuff happening in the background. The picture here I've got is it's just the Varroa Destructor Research Strategy from Agri-Futures. So as a Levitt industry, we have the Agri-Futures Honeybee and Pollination Advisory Panel, which is where our levy funds as honey producers goes, and then that money is used to spend on research for industry. Another example of that specific to Victoria is we have a committee called the Apiculture Industry Advisory Committee, I think it is. I always get the acronyms wrong, but and that's funded through our hive registrations in Victoria, and they're tasked with spending those funds on research for biosecurity, in particular. And so people can apply to them and get grant money to research biosecurity issues, or to do projects and things which support industry and address biosecurity issues in Victoria in particular. So I just wanted to mention them as well, because it's always good to know. With these sorts of things, you never know who's listening and who is looking to do work in an area, and often the answer is, but I don't have anywhere, I don't have funds to do that. Well, there's some little options for funds there, which I'll just plug. So coming back to, to summarize, really, I think my key message is that honeybees are critical to Australian food production, but healthy forests are critical to honeybee health. And we can't have one without the other. And biosecurity really underpins the sustainability of beekeeping into the future. But my final message about Varroa is that it's not impossible to adapt to it and to manage it, but it does require, or will require, interdisciplinary collaboration and support, and between industries and between ag industries, but also in terms of doing awareness and education and things like that to people in the community, so they can understand the connection as well. I hope I haven't talked too much, and I hope if anyone has questions, I think I would love to take them.
It's so amazing, Millie. Thank you so much for your presentation. I just couldn't help but listening to it all, thinking about how you're linking all the different kinds of actors or agents in the systems that underpin our food systems. It's just fascinating. I've popped a link to the Agri-Futures publication that you had up before in the chat too. I thought teachers might want to have a closer look at that, because it gives some real background to the challenges and how science is being used science and technology is being used to address that. I was curious because you have commercial operators, right, who I imagine are very motivated to take up practices to look at Varroa Mite prevention. What kind of strategies do you do to engage with recreational beekeepers then? Is that a challenge for the wider industry, or are people sort of getting on board because they love their bees and they want to do what's best for them?
Yeah, I think with anything, a comparison that's been made to me before or in the past is sort of with chickens. So lots of people have backyard chickens, and lots of people have huge chicken farms, right? And the biosecurity risks can often overlap between commercial and backyard chicken owners, like with bird flu and things like that. But chicken owners aren't registered. Backyard chicken owners aren't registered anywhere, right? And so it's really a matter of, so the government would probably do lots of awareness work as well, and education, as well as, you know, some industry stuff. But it is an interesting overlap, and it's similar, very similar with beekeepers, because although most of our beekeepers are registered, there are always a few that don't register because it is voluntary. Like you have to register, and it's free for anyone who's looking to keep bees, and it's super easy to do, but not everyone does, because there's always that element, you know, of people that don't. And with bees, like I said, it's very hard to manage because one swarm can spread into a tree, and no one's, you know, actively tracking all the swarms, although people do, and there's lots of community and there's lots of groups, and they're very, very active and passionate beekeeping groups in towns and cities. But it's probably something that's bigger than what we're as an industry able to do in terms of managing that. I know that our apiary officers within Agri-tech do a lot of work and have done a lot of work, particularly this Varroa introduction, or the transition to management is what it's called, period, on education. So not just the commercial industry, but a lot of work with recreational beekeepers. And I mean, the challenges that are posed are quite different, because one of the issues or the obstacles for a lot of commercial beekeepers is the cost. So to the cost of Varroa Mite treatments, because they're quite high. They're, you know, for an apiary our size, for the year for Varroa Mite treatments, like we could easily spend more than $50,000 or $100,000 on Varroa treatments alone. Our margins are not that big. And so it's about managing how much treatment you can afford to use, and the hive health and your practices and what you need to do to earn an income. As a recreational beekeeper with one hive, if you're spending $50 a year on Varroa treatment, it's not going to have the same economic impact on you because it's a hobby. It's something that you've chosen to do. And often those recreational beekeepers are more willing to spend not large amounts of money, but it's like anything, right? Like I quite like the idea of cheese making, and I spend a stupid amount of money on cheese making books and things. Yeah. And that's okay because that's my extra money that I play with. But it's a little bit different when you're doing it on a large scale. So I think the obstacles are quite different in terms of, you know, what the management between commercial and recreational.
Yeah. We've got a couple of school-based questions in the chat and the question and answer now. So I'm just going to grab this first one, which you might have alluded to a little bit in your answer just before. But what are the safest and most effective ways for schools to engage with beekeeping or pollinators?
So beekeeping safety, I didn't talk about that because I didn't have time to talk about everything, but I can touch on that now. I mean, some schools do have beehives, and I can never keep track of what's allowed in public schools and what's not, and what the rules are, because it seems to change over the years. But we get stung every day. So like I get stung every day. I get stung all over my body, often like 20 times sometimes if you're doing stuff in bad weather or whatever. So there's things you can do when you have a beehive to make it safer or less likely to get stung, like in terms of where they're positioned, what way the bees are flying, and you know, and various things. So having a beehive at your school is not necessarily unsafe, I wouldn't say. It's about, you know, space and positioning, and probably working with a local trained beekeeper who's willing to do that with you, and you know, having guidelines around that and EpiPens and all that sort of stuff that happens. I think that the first thing to do though would be to get in contact with a local beekeeper, so or a local beekeeping group, and talk to them about engaging, because there's lots of things that we do as beekeepers for our local community. Like our local primary school is shut down, but we used to always take, you know, honey and different beehives and things down to the primary school, and we do a whole talk at the primary school every year. We do the local show. We have like a stall. We have bees in like an enclosed thing so people can come and see the queen. They can see what it looks like inside the hive. We talk about the different parts of the hive and, you know, what happens in a beehive, and and food and, you know, all sorts of things. So there's lots of safe ways to do it. So I think talking to a local beekeeper first and foremost is the best option. And if you can't find one, I mean, commercial beekeepers will give you a slightly different perspective than a recreational beekeeper, but both are equally valid. And if you get a recreational beekeeper in and then you have students that are particularly interested in what it looks like as an industry, I'd say talk to a commercial beekeeper. If you, from it, I suppose from an education point of view, for people or kids that might want to get into beekeeping, talking to a commercial beekeeper is a better option because you can hear more about what it looks like from day to day, what it looks like to be a beekeeper, because it is quite different to your 9-to-5 lifestyle, and that some people that works for some people, but not everyone. Like often, you know, we drive through the night sometimes, we wake up in the bush in the morning camping out. It's glorious. Like, I love it, but I know that's not everyone's cup of tea. Like, and I just think we're so lucky. We get to spend some beautiful time on beautiful farms out in the middle of nowhere, working with only the sounds of the birds and the bees and lizards and things that come and say hi. So I'd say talk to a commercial beekeeper because they'll talk about why it's an amazing career.
Why is it an amazing career, Millie? How did you get into it? Like, how did you kind of find your way in it? And I know, like, I loved that it was like just a bit of a footnote in your bio that you're also a lawyer, but tell me more about like, how did you get into it
Yeah.
and build this kind of side of your career?
So my parents are both off. Well, originally their families were on farms in Gippsland, but then neither of them were farmers. And I, as a child, grew up mostly overseas, right? But we come back and would visit like small country town in Gippsland, Currambara, if anyone knows it, and come back and come up to like the Grampians or go up to Rocklands Reservoir and go fishing and do all that sort of stuff, that they're real, you know, country childhood things, and then would fly back overseas again. And I suppose there's that cultural, that family connection to rural living and regional communities that I always was interested in and wanted for myself as well. And then I came back to boarding school when I was in year 9, so in boarding school in Ballarat, and spent a lot of time hanging out with farmers off big farms who came down and really, and, you know, going back to their houses and their farms on weekends and on, you know, holidays and stuff, and enjoyed. And I think they sort of found my people, but I'm an academic kid, like I am a musician and things. So as you do when you're leaving school, I got good grades, and I got grades to go and do law. And so that's what I did. Actually, I went up to ANU in Canberra and I initially was studying international politics and advanced French literature and law. And I got sick of doing that quite quickly and switched my politics degree over to an environmental science degree because I enjoyed those subjects and the people that were doing those courses more. And then I got to do fun things like go off for excursions on farms and walk around and dig holes and look at soil and talk about all that sort of stuff. So, and I always really enjoyed that, but kept at the law and fell into family law. So I'm a family lawyer doing the rest of my time. But I'm all the way through university. So I got hives when I was 15, and then all the way through university, you'd come and work summer holidays or on the bees, because by then, you know, I was 50, we got had 100 hives or something. So this is my mum in the last photo. I don't know if I'm still sharing that or not, but mum and I work the bees together, and we love working together, and we quite enjoy each other, which is we fight quite a lot as well, but we get on really well. So part of working the bees for us is our relationship as well, and working with family. So which is we really enjoy. We're quite lucky that we get on well, and it just evolved naturally into a business. So when I was 15, I got 2 hives. So my pop's cousin, I call him my cousin, but he's 87 now. He was a commercial beekeeper in Central Victoria for 60 years. And when no one else in the family showed interest in bees, and then I came back to Australia, and when after mum and dad came back to Australia as well, and I said I wanted to get some beehives. We bought a little farm, I want to get beehives. So he set us up with some beehives. which I don't think they survived, to be honest. But we were fascinated. I was fascinated from then. Bees are one of these things that are sort of weird, but once you start to learn about them, and I think it's that love of learning. Like for people that like to learn constantly or new things, bees will always give you something new to learn. Forever. It's very interesting creatures. So I think that was, I fell in love with them then. And then ever since then, we've just got more and more and more bees. And at a certain point, I think probably like when I was at university, we had too many bees to not be trying to make a business from it. And, you know, and so, but we started off, so we didn't start off with anything. We started off with, you know, I think a mentor and someone that we could ask questions, and a very generous Cole, like our Cole, his name's Cole, is a very generous man who really just wanted to share his passion for beekeeping with someone, and we were lucky to be those people. And finding a mentor, and that mentorship, I know it's one of those cliche things, but having a mentor or someone that you get on well with that is willing to give up their time for you makes all the difference in our industry in particular. And we just grew from there. So we never had big business plans or loans or anything. We put our spare money into buying more equipment, and you know, we only got a truck a couple of years ago, but eventually we got a trailer, and we got bought stuff as we went, which is a very different path. I know a lot of people, you know, they decide they want to run a business, and then they get a loan and they buy everything and then they risk it. Which can work, but I think with something like beekeeping, it's pretty niche, and there's a lot of layers of knowledge to it, it just takes years to learn, and that's where that having a mentor or getting involved with people that are running bees commercially and learning, hanging around them for a couple of years is the ideal, because you can see if it's for you or not. Because like with lots of farming, some people wouldn't think of it as an easy lifestyle, but you're in it for the lifestyle. Like it's fantastic. And I mean, spending time out in the bush, hanging out, a bit of hard work, bit of sweat, you know, a bit of swearing sometimes as well. Things go wrong, but yeah, I love it. And I think it's the perfect counterpoint to practicing law, which is inside, intense, very, you know, constrained and focused. Whereas when you're working bees, there's a flow to it. And it's all, you know, it's calming really for us. You know, there's a system, and you work hard, you start work at, you know, whatever time you start work, and you stop for your morning tea, and then you keep working, and you just get to the end of the day and you're ready for a nice sleep, and it's, you know, you've done a good day's work. And we really enjoy it.
You sold me on it,
do
and
anything else.
and it sounds like it's an industry of continuous learning, because it sounds like there's always challenges coming up, and you know, you need to make decisions and see what's coming down the pipeline, like learning these new techniques or practices to implement for your bee health. We've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to hit you with the last question I've got here, which is, how can schools help build awareness of biosecurity? So it's a term that people outside of agriculture don't often hear. How can they build awareness of biosecurity and encourage students or their families to think about protecting Australian beekeeping?
So yeah, that is a good question. I mean, it's a little bit of a hard one as well, because I suppose it comes down to understanding what it means for bees and what biosecurity means for bees, and sometimes a basic understanding of what bees are doing when they pollinate, of what beekeepers are doing when they're moving their bees around to different orchards or different food production is what they need to protect biosecurity. So it's not a direct answer, right? It's not like, oh, you shouldn't do this or you should do that. There's not an action to it, but more of a, well, you know, understanding, well, this bit of fruit required people to move around and do that, and without some, you know, without some regulations or some laws or some constraints around, you know, the introduction of, you know, different foods or different species or on borders and all that sort of stuff, then we wouldn't be able to eat those foods, or we wouldn't be able to have, you know, they wouldn't be pollinated. So it's not an easy one. from my perspective, but I'm sure there's some smarter brains than mine listening who can put that into a way that kids can understand it easier.
Yeah.
But as well, in terms of being responsibility for livestock or for pets or for animals or plants that you buy and that you own, and being a responsible beekeeper is as easy as being engaged with a community, a beekeeping community, or or at a market with your local beekeeper, and asking them questions. So it doesn't mean, and I think this is something that is a bit of a misnomer. People think, oh, to protect the bees, I need to become a beekeeper. You don't. You can support the beekeep. You can support food production locally. You can think about, well, what am I putting in my garden that feeds the bees or that might hurt the bees? Because lots of sprays and weed killers and pesticides kill pests, but they also kill other insects. So there's smarter ways, and you can learn how to use things in our garden to protect pollination and protect beekeepers and bees as well. Is that an all right answer?
That's wonderful, Millie. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to get off this webinar just thinking so much about the bees. I think the thing that stuck with me most is like referring to them as livestock. And I never really thought of them as livestock, but it makes so much sense. We were really lucky with the program to take some students out on a different Race Victoria activity. We run Food and Fibre Industry School Partnership Program. So if there's any teachers out there that are interested in some of the other race activities, we will come to your school. We supply a bus and we'll organise an excursion to visit an agricultural business so that students can learn more about the world of work. We were lucky to take someone to meet a beekeeper, and they explained the social dynamics of the hive, and I was like, mind blown. Like, it's amazing.
I didn't have time to get into that today.
No, that's okay. Maybe we'll have to have you back at some stage. But yeah, Millie, thank you so much for your time. And thanks everyone for tuning in and or listening to the recording when you get this later this week. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Nicole.
Okay, thank you. Bye.